Well, welcome back to our course on Christian apologetics. This is getting into the details, and so this is our first collaboration session. And so we talked about this in the introduction, but we'll have 4 sessions, plus we'll have dedicated videos going through some of the material looking at specific apologists. And so this is what we're going to get into for this first lecture, is just give an overview of the course, give an introduction to the vast area of Christian apologetics. And for those that are taking the course, we'll want to give a little bit of information about the paper project. So here are the 3 textbooks that we will be using. The Christian Apologetics, it's an anthology of primary sources, and so there's a lot of good information. So instead of having you run around trying to find those primary sources, you can just go ahead and use this information. And it crosses all the way back from the early church to modern writers, and so I think you'll find that helpful. We'll also be using Douglas Gruthis, his Christian Apologetics, the second edition, which is the most current version that's available. And we'll get into the details for each one of these as we progress. And finally, we'll be looking at Francis Schaeffer's the trilogy that focuses on his books, The God Who Is There, Escape from Reason, and He Is There and He Is Not Silent. And what we'll have is a little bit of focus of these 3 textbooks in each one of these collaboration sessions. Once again, for those that are taking this course at Regent, and I highly recommend that you all consider that, this just gives you an idea of the things that will be looked at in terms of your getting credit for the course. So you have 2 choices. You can either be doing a research paper or you can be doing a special project. And so for the research paper, this gives you the normal idea of what it is, looking at a topic of your choice, whether it be apologetic methodology, objections to Christian faith, and the Christian response on an area that you find is interesting to you. You could also be doing a special project, say you interview a person that does not espouse a Christian worldview in a respectful way. You document how you engage with that individual. And so that always is a fun experience, so you can be thinking about that. So you want to be writing down your observations, and not only would this be an interesting thing for you to do this assignment, but hopefully you can be sharing it with some of your students, some of your fellow students, and maybe something that you'll be leveraging in the future. Okay, for the first of our 3 textbooks, Christian Apologetics, we can see that there is a lot of information that we're going to be covering here, at least in terms of what is available to you. We'll just be focusing on readings and topics for some of this, but you can see in a second edition it's expanded and there's a total of 32 chapters that you can be looking at. And it's broken up into 3 sections: apologetic preliminaries, 2, the case for Christian theism, and 3, objections to Christian theism. So a lot of different chapters supporting each one of these. And he also has an introduction looking at hope, despair, and knowing reality. And so how can we make a way to really having a clear understanding of the world around us? And so that helps us with that. So for the preliminaries, we'll look at the biblical basis for apologetics. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? Looking at the apologetic method of how we're evaluating worldviews and how does the Christian worldview compare to others. Then we get into the specifics of, well, we're trying to evaluate, so we need to make sure we clearly understand the Christian worldview to help out. We'll look at the distortions of the Christian worldview, or as Groithus puts, the God I don't believe in. And so there are plenty of distortions, unfortunately, out there that we want to be aware of. Truth defined and defended, we want to make sure we're looking at that. Why truth matters most, searching for truth in a postmodern times. And so we had the modern synthesis, and after that comes the postmodern synthesis of how we view reality. And we're still in that area. And so that's what we'll get a chance to be focused on. We'll look at faith, risk, and rationality, the prudential incentives to Christian faith. Part two, we have the case for Christian theism, a defense of theistic arguments, original monotheism, the ontological arguments, and so we have these various arguments, cosmological arguments, a cause for the cosmos, and there's actually a regent course that I teach that's looking at that largely, cosmology and cosmogony, the design argument, the cosmic fine-tuning, the argument from beauty. We'll get it to think about origins, design, and Darwinism, evidence for intelligence design, the moral argument for God, and there's just a lot of things here. Argument from religious experience, the uniqueness of humanity, so we'll be being made in the Imago Dei, depose royalty, thinking about Pascal's ontological argument, doubt, skepticism, and the hiddenness of God, Jesus of Nazareth, how historians can know him and why it matters, claims, credentials, and achievements of Jesus Christ, the atonement, stating it properly, the atonement, defending it, defending the incarnation, the resurrection of Jesus. We'll be looking at over a couple of chapters in this textbook, so Prolegomena and on miracles and the evidence, and finally the defense of the church. And what are some of the objections to Christian theism? So you can see we want to make sure that we clearly understand it first. There's a religious pluralism where we have many religions, and the argument is that there's one truth. From that point of view, apologetic and the challenge of Islam, the problem of evil, and the lament as an apologist for Christianity. So a lot of material that Groithus makes available, and that's a good book. Well, we're not only going to give an overview of our anthology, but also go through some specific readings. But first, let's give an overview. So this is from the introduction. This is a sampling of some of the best works written by Christian apologists through the centuries. And so we get a wide spectrum, and it's almost amazing that you have early church writers right next to contemporary writers on topics. And its goal is to provide a snapshot of Christian apologetics at its best across the spectrum of time and culture. So what they're trying to do is provide evidence for them and how it's been honed, refined, and forged in the anvils of logic, reason, and history. And so you can see some of that development as you compare the early church fathers versus others. And there's arguments and evidences that can be powerful sources for removing barriers to faith. And that's the basic apologetic goal. And God's work in individual lives is what ultimately transforms. And we want to provide the information that can help an individual have answers to their questions. So just trying to get a chance to see the totality of the anthology. There's 11 parts where we focus on history, methodology, and engagement, the existence of God, the Trinity, incarnation, the Bible, miracles, the resurrection of Jesus, body, soul, and the arguments from mind, the problem of evil, Christianity and science, and finally, the Christianity and the world. Okay, well, let's look at Groithus and have a couple of definitions of things that will help us. And first of all, this is him trying to explain what is Christian apologetics. And so Christian apologetics is the rational defense of the Christian worldview as objectively true, rationally compelling, and existentially or subjectively engaging. The word apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which can be translated to defense or vindication. So apologetics is an aspect of the philosophy of religion that is broadly understood, which is the rational investigation of religious truth claims. Apologetics is linked to theology, philosophy, and evangelism, but is not reducible to any one of these disciplines. So that's something for us to be thinking about. I would also put biblical exegesis as another thing. Well, what about epistemology? So how we know what we know. This is what Groithus says on that. It is in human beings that heaven and earth meet in thought. Made in God's image, we are personal beings who can detect God's fingerprints in creation and his voice and conscience through scripture. We were designed to know God, ourselves, others, and God's creation. As James Sire put it, human beings can know both the world around them and God himself because God has built into them the capacity to do so, and because he takes an active role in communicating with them. Scripture affirms that human beings through east of Eden, though east of Eden, are not banished to the utter darkness concerning themselves, their world, or God. God has made knowledge of these realms possible, though not all will attain a true and rational understanding of these things. And then continuing on, the Gospels indicate that Jesus had a well-formed epistemology. He believed the objective truth is knowable, that is realism, that factual evidence is critical in supporting truth claims, and non-contradiction is a necessary test for truth. That the truth Jesus reveals has experiential effect, that the imagination is a key organ for receiving truth. You can think about that in his use of parables and figures of speech, and that one's ability to know truth is closely tied to one's moral rectitude. All of these principles are brought together in the course of Groithus's book, and we walk through the table of contents, and so you get a little bit of sense of that. So we'll finish up with just thinking a little bit about Francis Schaeffer, and then we'll get into the trilogy. And so this is something that I saw that William Lane Craig was describing about Schaeffer. And so this is a two-story universe and the practical impossibility of atheism. Modern man resides in a two-story universe. The lower story is a finite world without God. Here, life is absurd. In the upper story are meaning, value, and purpose. Now, modern man lives in the lower story because he believes there is no God, but he cannot live happily in such an absurd world. Therefore, he continually makes leaps of faith into the upper story to affirm meaning, value, and purpose, even though he has no right to do since he does not believe in God. Modern man is totally inconsistent when he makes this leap because these values cannot exist without God, and man in his lower story does not have God. And then in terms of the trilogy, this is from the editor's introduction, but I think it's quite interesting, and then we'll get a little bit into his thoughts for the trilogy. The trilogy brings together Francis Schaeffer's three fundamental books into one volume. He saw these three books as essential to everything he wrote, and he wrote 23 books in all, so there's a lot of things that he laid out. We have decided to reissue these three books in this new edition as a trilogy, and so I'd recommend that you go ahead and get the trilogy as a set. And in fact, much of his writing seems as contemporary today as when his books were first purchased. Interesting enough, but I think you'll get that same impression. I got that every time I get exposed to it in more detail, including having the fun time of preparing for these lectures. So Francis Schaeffer's unique contribution is seen in his ability to understand the desperate need of modern man from truth, beauty, meaning in life. This was especially evident in the work of L'Abri Fellowship in Switzerland, founded by Francis and Edith Schaeffer, centered largely in their home. Thousands came to L'Abri from all walks of life and from around the world. Although I'm not an expert in French, I do have some experience in there in L'Abri. It's Old French for shelter. You can say the shelter, being safe from danger or, quote, exposed to the sun. And you can be thinking that as in terms of protect from the wind, cold, and darkness. All of these are the characteristics that they try to make evident in Labrie. Then for the three books that are in the trilogy, first, God Who Was There was first written. It laid the foundation, established the terminology instead of the basic thesis in the book. Schaeffer shows how modern thought has abandoned the idea of truth with tragic consequences in every area of culture, from philosophy to art to music to theology, and within society as a whole. The only hope, Schaeffer argues, is to confront our culture with a historic Christian truth presented in the compassion and without compromise and lived out fully in every area of personal and corporate life. And trying to show how that could be done at Labrie, there's been thousands who've had that experience to see what that is all about. Then in Reason, Escape from Reason, it complements the first book by working out these principles in the philosophical area of nature and grace. Escape from Reasons, moreover, makes a significant contribution in showing how modern culture has grown from corrupt roots, reaching far back into the late Middle Ages. And then finally, he is there and he is not silent. Schaeffer explains in his own word that this book deals with one of the most fundamental of all questions: how we know we know. Unless our epistemology is right, everything else is going to be wrong. And we'll be focusing on that quote in a larger context a little bit later. Thus, Schaeffer argues that modern thought is fundamentally wrong in its assumptions about how we know and what we know. In contrast to the silence and despair of modern man, Schaeffer shows that we indeed know the God who is there because he is not silent. Okay, thank you very much. That's our first highlights for what we'll be covering in our first collaboration session. Thank you.